Let's take a moment to talk about a letter that Donald Trump reportedly sent to the Prime Minister of Norway, because this is not normal, and the reaction around the world tells you that immediately. This isn't just another headline. This is one of those moments where breaking news crosses into genuine concern. I want to be clear up front in this video. I'm not only reporting what happened. I'm speaking as an American who is deeply worried about where this is going. According to the letter, Trump openly admits that his anger over not receiving a Nobel Peace Prize has changed how he thinks. By his own words, he says he is no longer focused purely on peace. He then uses that grievance as justification for threatening to invade Greenland, annex it, and take it by force using the U.S. military. This is the same man who campaigned on the promise of no new wars. And yet here he is, threatening countries across our own hemisphere and escalating conflict with allies we've relied on for decades. That contradiction alone should stop everyone cold. I spend most days on this channel sticking to the facts. What happened? Who said what the documents show. But today, it's impossible not to say this plainly. This is alarming. I live in this country. I respect this country. I respect the institutions that, while far from perfect, have helped us move forward over time. America once stood for democracy, cooperation, and human dignity. Under Donald Trump, what we're seeing instead is intimidation, isolation, and open hostility toward allies. This kind of rhetoric is not new in world history. It's familiar and not in a good way. The last time leaders used ego-driven threats to justify territorial expansion, the world paid an enormous price. That is not exaggeration. That is historical fact. Now, before even getting into the contents of the letter, let's rewind a few days. After publicly threatening Greenland for more than a year, Trump announced tariffs against NATO allies who refused to back him in that threat, including Denmark, which governs Greenland and is itself a NATO ally. That detail matters. These are countries we are treaty bound to defend. There was a simple alternative here. Trump could have picked up the phone and said, "We've been allies for decades. We've operated joint military bases before. Let's strengthen our presence together." Denmark almost certainly would have said yes. That's how alliances work. Instead, Trump chose confrontation, putting everyone at greater risk. He then announced new tariffs against European countries amid this Greenland standoff, targeting Denmark and 7 other nations with a proposed 10% rate. Now, it's worth noting that Trump frequently announces tariffs and then delays them or backs off entirely. He has a long track record of doing that. Still, the damage is already done because world leaders are listening. Those leaders are currently gathered at the World Economic Forum, where Trump is scheduled to appear and face the very people he has been threatening. The countries directly targeted include Norway, Sweden, France, Germany, the United Kingdom, the Netherlands, and Finland, all NATO members, all U.S. allies. Yesterday, those countries issued a joint response. And while diplomatic language is usually careful and restrained, the message here was unmistakable. They reaffirmed their commitment, as NATO members, to strengthening Arctic security together as a shared transatlantic priority. That statement alone tells you everything. America's allies are signaling cooperation. Donald Trump is signaling escalation. And that gap should concern every single one of us. The response from America's allies could not have been more direct. They said plainly that Arctic security is a shared responsibility. A joint Danish-led military exercise conducted alongside allied nations was described as defensive, transparent, and necessary. It was not aimed at provoking anyone. It was meant to protect sovereignty. Those countries made something else unmistakably clear. They stand fully with Denmark and with the people of Greenland. They said they are open to dialogue, but only dialogue grounded in respect for borders, national sovereignty, and territorial integrity. Those principles, they emphasized, are non-negotiable. Because of Trump's threats, several of these countries mobilized troops, not large forces, in some cases just symbolic numbers, to participate in exercises in Greenland. The message wasn't subtle. It was, this territory is not up for grabs. Tariff threats, they warned, only weaken transatlantic relationships and risk setting off a dangerous chain reaction. Their conclusion was unified and firm. They will remain coordinated, they will stand together, and they will defend their sovereignty. And it is at that moment, when allies stand up in writing, calmly and collectively, that Donald Trump escalates again. His response, according to this letter, is essentially this: because he didn't get the Nobel Peace Prize, he no longer feels obligated to think only about peace. That is not an exaggeration. That is what the letter says. At some point, this stops being about policy disagreements and becomes about temperament. Trump reacts badly, consistently, when he is told no. We have seen this pattern for decades. And now, when an international coalition pushes back, the reaction is grievance, retaliation, and threat. This channel is usually about reporting the facts. But today, I want to be honest, this is me speaking as a deeply concerned American. Many of you watching live in the United States. Many of you don't. But what connects us is that we care about democracy, stability, and the basic rules that prevent global chaos. I've been worried for a long time. If you've watched this channel, you know that. But waking up early in the morning, reading through this document line by line, it hits differently. This is not abstract anymore. The letter itself did not stop with Norway. According to reporting, it was forwarded by National Security Council staff to multiple European ambassadors in Washington. In other words, this wasn't just a message to one prime minister. It was a broad warning sent across Europe. The introduction reads, "The president has requested that this message be shared with your head of government." And then comes Trump's own language. He tells Norway's prime minister that because his country did not award him the Nobel Peace Prize, despite what he claims were 8 wars he personally stopped, he no longer feels bound to think purely in terms of peace. He asserts that Denmark cannot protect Greenland from Russia or China. He questions Denmark's legal claim to the territory at all, dismissing centuries of history and international law with a wave of the hand. This is not strategy. This is not diplomacy. This is grievance weaponized into foreign policy. And that is why allies are mobilizing, not against a foreign adversary, but to deter the United States of America. That fact alone should sober everyone watching this. The letter ends with a claim that should immediately raise eyebrows. Trump writes that he has done more for NATO than any individual since the alliance was founded, and that now NATO should do something for the United States. He then concludes with this extraordinary statement that the world cannot be secure unless the United States has complete and total control of Greenland. Let's slow that down, because nearly every part of it is wrong and dangerous. First, the posture itself. This is not the language of a stable leader. It reflects impulsiveness, grievance, and a fundamental misunderstanding of how global security actually works. That combination, anger paired with poor judgment, is not just concerning, it's destabilizing. Especially when it's coming from the President of the United States. What's at stake here is the international system that has benefited America more than any other country since World War II. That system was built after unimaginable destruction, entire cities flattened, millions killed, families torn apart, soldiers never returning home. No one wants to return to that world. Out of that devastation came NATO. Not a global empire, not a free for all, but a voluntary alliance of developed democracies who agreed on a simple principle: collective defense. Since NATO's founding, there has not been another world war among its members. That is not an accident. That is the alliance doing exactly what it was designed to do. If Greenland or Denmark itself were ever threatened by Russia or China, Article 5 of NATO would be triggered. The United States would be legally and militarily obligated to defend them. That protection already exists. Trump's claim that Denmark cannot protect Greenland ignores the central fact of the alliance he is now undermining. What Trump is effectively saying in this letter is, forget Article 5, forget NATO, forget the rules. We will simply take what we want. That approach does not create security. It invites chaos, because once that rulebook is torn up, others follow. Russia pushes further into Ukraine and beyond. China moves on Taiwan. Global supply chains fracture. Semiconductor access disappears. Prices rise. Instability spreads. Escalation feeds escalation. History tells us exactly where that road leads. And yet this letter shows no evidence of thinking even a few steps ahead. Then there are the factual claims. Trump asserts that he stopped 8 wars. There is no evidence for that. Ongoing conflicts, including Gaza, continue with devastating consequences. He claims he was denied the Nobel Peace Prize unfairly. What he either doesn't know or doesn't acknowledge is that the nomination deadline for the Nobel Prize closed at the end of January. He is expressing outrage over not being nominated just days into his term for actions that hadn't even happened yet. He writes that he no longer feels obligated to think purely about peace. But there was never a widespread belief that he did. From the beginning of his presidency, he has favored force, intimidation, and domestic troop deployments. This rhetoric doesn't project strength. It erodes it. Behind the scenes, many Republican lawmakers are reportedly furious about this escalation. The real question is whether they will say so publicly and directly. Trump then questions Denmark's right to Greenland altogether, dismissing centuries of governance, treaties, and international law. The logic he uses would unravel borders everywhere, including America's own. That is not a serious argument. It's a reckless one. Finally, there is the claim that he has done more for NATO than anyone since its founding. That simply does not withstand scrutiny. Under the previous administration, NATO not only strengthened, it expanded. 2 new countries joined because the alliance was made more credible, not less. That is leadership rooted in stability, not grievance. and that is the contrast at the center of this moment. This isn't just another controversial statement. It's a warning sign about how power is being viewed, how alliances are being treated, and how close rhetoric is drifting toward consequences no one actually wants. History has seen this before, and it does not end well. Those countries didn't just join NATO, they increased their defense spending and chose to become part of what is arguably the most successful alliance in modern history. And it's not hard to understand why. If you are a country in Eastern Europe and you have Russia right next door, constantly pressuring, threatening, testing your borders, of course you want the protection of an alliance. NATO functions like collective insurance. An attack on one is treated as an attack on all. That shared commitment changes the calculation entirely. Compare that to standing alone, exposed, hoping you won't be next. History shows us how that ends. Ukraine is the clearest example. Ukraine was not allowed to join NATO because it was already facing Russian interference and conflict. And because it was not covered by NATO's Article 5 protections, Russia was able to invade. If Ukraine had been a NATO member, that invasion would almost certainly not have happened. Its borders would still be intact. That's the real lesson here. So when people in Greenland and Denmark say, clearly and firmly, that their land is not something to be taken, they are asserting a basic principle: sovereignty matters, borders matter, consent matters. And this is where Donald Trump's behavior becomes especially concerning. He does not seem to recognize limits, legal, diplomatic, or moral. He repeatedly treats power as something to be exercised downward, rather than something constrained by rules. You hear this echoed by figures around him as well. Stephen Miller, for example, has argued that Greenland is essential to U.S. national security because future global competition will focus on the Arctic. That first point is not controversial. Greenland is strategically important, but here is where the argument takes a dark turn. Instead of saying, this is why alliances matter, or this is why cooperation with Denmark and NATO is vital, the implication becomes, therefore, a larger country should simply take control of a smaller one. That leap from shared security to domination is what should alarm everyone. Yes, Arctic routes matter. Yes, navigation lanes in polar regions are increasingly important. But Greenland's size, Denmark's military capacity, or its economy do not justify seizure or coercion. That is imperial thinking, not strategic thinking. This kind of rhetoric suggests leaders talking themselves into escalation, reinforcing each other's worst instincts rather than questioning them. History shows us what happens when grievance, ambition, and raw power replace rules and alliances. And that's where I'll leave it. Independent media exists to question power, not cheer it on. If you value that work, stay engaged, stay informed, and keep paying attention because moments like this matter.